everyone, and welcome to the Cathy Reisenwitz Show. We're going to have the amazing Angela Keaton on from Antiwarcom a little bit later. But while we're waiting for her to show up, I just want to kind of run through the news a little bit. Apparently, Alabama has finally struck down its anti-sodomy law. This is a law that made it illegal for people who are not married to engage in oral or anal sex. And what's fascinating about this is that it was pretty clearly aimed at harassing, giving legal pretext to give cops the ability to harass gay people. And that's exactly what they did in 2010, which is what brought it up to the Supreme Court. And I love this. I love, first, that it was struck down. I mean, that's obviously amazing and a win for liberty and common sense and freedom everywhere. But I also love how, according to the Jezebel report, there are still 11 states with sodomy laws on the books. Everyone acts like this stuff is over, that state-sanctioned homophobia is over, that the civil rights struggle is over, and it just shows that it's not at all, that homophobia obviously still exists in our society, and that it forms the basis for some pretty horrific laws, and that cops are using these laws to harass people who do things that they don't really enjoy. But now we are joined by our beautiful guest, Angela. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Great. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I won't play with any more controls or settings then.
Okay, good. All right, I'll introduce you. Angela Keaton is Director of Operations at Antiwarcom. She is a self-described anarchist bitch. Her Twitter bio describes her as skeptic, hater, feminist, robot, emoticon-free, against power, and cat pics. She's interested in foreign policy, tabloids, and the gym. #FreeChelsea. Thank you so much for having taking the time to join me today. I want to first talk about the ongoing saga of the Antiwarcom lawsuit against the FBI. Yay for suing the government. That's exciting. Where are you in that? What's the backstory?
Oh gosh, I'm glad we have a few minutes because it's a long and fun one, and I enjoy telling it because it's so ridiculous. Back in 2011, you know, minding our own business, you know, the boss calls and tells me, "Are you sitting down?" And this is never a good way to start a conversation ever with that tone of voice. Nothing ever good comes from that. But apparently, a reader had tipped my boss Eric Garris, who's the founder and basically the CEO of Antiwarcom, and the reader said, you know, we found someone loaded a Freedom of Information Act request on one of these big sites that has large documents, and in it, and this person, some blogger who did some issues that are kind of ancillary, kind of interesting about 9/11, but not really on topic, and it's a small blog. He asked for Freedom of Information request, and he got back a huge stack of papers on all sorts of things relating to that. But about 10 pages of that was about Antiwarcom, and another 10 pages was about our editorial director, Justin Raimondo. Now, what it indicated basically was that what it was asking the question was whether or not in these files was that the feds wanted to know if Antiwarcom had received, you know, was an agent of a foreign power, basically, just cutting right to the chase, or receives any foreign funding. And there was a lot along those things too that the feds were interested in, and it seemed to trigger a preliminary investigation. This happened. The information indicated this was somewhere 2002 to 2004. Well, okay, one thing leads to another. The ACLU gets a hold of it. They can't wait to take the case, and of course, information back and forth and flying and denials and non-denials and much more. And I say blacked out, I really mean whited out stacks of papers. What we do know is that Antiwarcom has been under investigation for quite some time, at least 10 years, and as recently as 2012. And that Eric Garris and Justin Raimondo, now this part shouldn't be too shocking for those who know their libertarian history, but they've actually been under surveillance quite some time. The surveillance of Eric Garris actually goes back to 1971 and possibly with the Peace and Freedom Party. So, you know, and that seems reasonable. I mean, yes, people should have been looking at, if you're taking the government's point of view on things, should have been looking at libertarians in the 1970s. You know, they were pretty radical. And the Libertarian Party was a very, very radical then too. So that kind of makes sense from their point of view. But Antiwar.com is being monitored, and what the outcome is that some people got nervous. We had some donors literally, oh no, I can't do this. And it's understandable too, especially with people who've got some money, they don't really want to lose it, and they don't want to embroil themselves with any extra drama. I mean, this is something that, activists take it for granted. Like, you live in a certain amount of denial if you do certain kinds of work. Like, yeah, okay, the phones are being listened to, but if you thought about that all the time, you wouldn't be able to communicate properly, just in a natural state of affairs. And it's intentionally, it really does undermine your normal sense of self. But of course, now thanks to Snowden, we know that everyone, has been being listened to, though we don't know how much and what attention and so on. But it did change the way some of the people saw Antiwar.com. It did hurt our funding significantly, and I think it did make some people think a little bit harder about being in the anti-war movement. But people who know their anti-war movement history knows that anti-war activists have been under surveillance since World War I. So that's not anything new, or that part, that's been going on, and there's been FBI investigations in 2010 and 2011. The Midwest has a lot of active anti-war groups. Minnesota's a place where you couldn't go 3 feet without finding an anti-war activist. So people who've been very active, particularly in causes like justice for Palestinians, have been given a little extra attention, perhaps, than normal activists would be. But cannot make sense. I mean, war is the health of the state. I mean, the most controversial thing anyone challenges is war, and it's the most basic thing that libertarians should be thinking about. Because if we can't solve the mass murder problem, I'm not really sure what we're going to do about the rest of our agenda. It just seems that we should probably maybe try, seeing what we can do about those basics: war, occupation, torture, these very basic human rights issues that, just by born of being human, and whether you believe natural rights are from God or reason or whatever, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you can't reason well enough to think in the old-fashioned objectivist sense that, that this kind of mass murder is just unacceptable, then I don't know how we're going to get people around thinking in terms of non-aggression and thinking in terms of, what's a logical, rational way of treating and interacting and trading with people. So I'm hoping that this is sort of that the third round of Iraq, because it seems like the war with Iraq never really ends. Now it gets taken up, a large chunk of my life. That libertarians can think really what are the most important principles, what are the first principles, and this is where I think people are their compassion's tested too. I mean, presumably you understand why you don't want your neighbors to be victims of the drug war. I mean, your neighbors are people you interact with, but someplace like Afghanistan might as well be on Mars for most people. I mean, it's bad enough the horrible, and let's call it what it is. It is a horrible agitprop racism against Arabs, Central Asians, and Muslims. Even though we don't think of the term racism in that sense, what we're talking about is some really horrible collective bigotry that's that comes through in our art, comedy, and from our politicians to make us think in really hard racist terms, and allows us to dehumanize people that are, let's say, Afghanistan or Waziristan. I mean, that does look like the landscape of Mars. I mean, those people might not be real to most of us. So what we think about our compassion towards them, and that the basics should be that we shouldn't be dropping bombs. We certainly shouldn't be sending killer robots to wipe out entire families. That should just be basic. I mean, we're supposed to be, it's sickness, So I'm sorry, I can keep ranting.
Right.
I had
something that I really like. No, it's good. Something that I really like about your work is that it does focus on the kind of first principles and recognizes the pernicious nature of our kind of knee-jerk reaction, where people have this tendency to dehumanize. I mean, you saw the brouhaha about the Heritage Panel, where Jana Milbank was, kind of painted it as extremely anti-Muslim, and then video came out and it was a little less hostile to the Muslim woman in attendance than, he painted it as. But the fact of the matter is they had a panelist who describes herself as one of the top experts on terrorism, who is on record saying that Arabs are barbarians, right? And so you see this, exactly what you're talking about, this othering, this dehumanizing of people that leads us to exactly what you're talking about, dropping bombs on people and depriving them of rights and torturing them. And I think that that's kind of, it makes you a little bit of a rare libertarian, and it's something that I really like about your work, that you see the roots of the problem, not just the branches, which is war, but the roots, which is that dehumanization, that othering. One thing that I wanted to touch on briefly that I really liked about what you were saying And I also want to say, this is a really good opportunity with a lawsuit. Antiwar.com has lost a lot of funders that are put off by that whole situation, but I really want to see you guys pick up a lot of funders who are very interested in that situation, who want to support any kind of lawsuit against the government, because it's a very chilling effect. It does chill the anti-war movement, which is so essential for libertarianism and for human flourishing and for freedom, to know that they're under surveillance. And you've seen it in the members, in the donors that you've lost, and I'm sure you've seen it in the partners that don't want to work with you, knowing that you're under surveillance. And so we need a new crop who's excited about the opportunity to fight the surveillance state. But I'm curious, we've talked a little bit about this in the past. You said that in the 70s the libertarian movement was more radical. It seems like that to me. I began reading about liberty really in the early 2000s, and Reason Magazine did a good job, especially like Jesse Walker and Brian Doherty, of kind of chronicling that history. And I thought that that's what I was getting into when I got into liberty. And then I see this like weird, Republican, social conservative thing, and I'm like, this is not the liberty I signed up for. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Oh gosh, the whole history. Yeah, I do a lot of reading and thinking about the libertarian movement for various reasons. But one of the main ones is trying to understand, how we got to where we are and what the priorities are. This is a long, complicated question, but there's several wings of right-wingery, and I tend to take and this isn't a contrarian view. I think this is actually a normal, critique of power. But at times, at least since the empire became the real issue in 2001. I mean, this is the time frame that you were thinking about. I'm trying even, maybe I should back it up even further. There's always been different strains, and there's always been attempts by different groups on the right to kind of come in and take it in the co-optation. But co-optation's really never been the problem. It's always been the internal lack of focus on what the philosophies really are, what the most basic things are, the set of priorities. And for a long time, the Libertarian Party goes through periods like this, and the Libertarian movement does, but it becomes a very, very narrow set of of interests that make libertarians easy to parody. That it really is just for a certain kind of either computer programmer, dope smoking atheist who doesn't want to beat up on queers too much and just doesn't want to pay too many in taxes. You get that sort of stereotype, and that's one kind of right-wing type, but certainly one that isn't malignant. But you get a lot of, having a large group of libertarians in D.C., there's an overlap between, let's say, with the corporate right and the libertarian movement that I've always found disturbing. And this isn't any insult to our friends who are part of the Koch world or the D.C. world, but that's a very conservative form of libertarianism that tends to take the most, when I say moderate, the least offensive approaches, the ones that are going to cause the least amount of ruffling, which, I guess is fine if you're trying to appeal only to elites, but it really isn't a very radical approach, and it tends to, and this is going to be controversial, I'm sure upset everybody, but there's never been an anti-racist movement in the libertarian movement. There's been anti-Rothbard and anti-Rockwell things, but there's never been an anti-racist movement. And one of the problems with having libertarians in the Beltway is that you get people who are very, very willing to basically support genocide, and this gets back to the war issue. I mean, you can't say, it's not very real to me that someone can say, really, I get what's wrong with the drug war, and I understand what's wrong with racism, and then condemn entire civilizations to endless onslaught of bombs and chemicals and disruption and occupation and basically literally kidnapping people and putting them into the worst, darkest dungeons that the U.S. owns that are well documented. There's nothing here conspiratorial. It's all right there. Read the New York Times. That to me is just, it's outrageous and disgraceful. And it's also, I think, and I really want to thank Sheldon Richman for kind of beating this over my head. But when I was a little kid, South Africa was an issue, having an apartheid state. If you don't think, one of the most basic libertarian issues is state hierarchy, state racism. That's what apartheid is. That's exactly what that is. It's horrible. And libertarians have really, one time libertarians were on the vanguard of things like this and were really, really behind, particularly in the issue of the colonization Palestinians. And I think that kind of racism and then a willingness to overlook that and a willingness to apologize, not even apologize, but to accept people who still think that that's acceptable in 2014 seems to me that that's really, like, we learn nothing from the newsletters. We're still stuck in the same place, and that there's no career loss, or you don't suffer very much in your career if you supported a war of aggression. I mean, there are people that it's shocking to me that, wow, you're accepted in polite society. I mean, you know, when you're talking about wars, you're talking about killing civilians, you're talking about killing children. I don't know under what, I mean, in any other context, would talking about killing children would be that cavalier about it? I mean, it's really morally reprehensible. I mean, libertarianism isn't just about low taxes or the ability to pick which kind of light bulbs you want to use. It's the right not to be killed by, you know, the people with the monopoly of force. That's a basic human right. And then besides, on a very rational level, I don't know anyone in Iraq. I think I've met exactly 2 Iraqis, 3 in my entire life. What kind of war would I be having with them? I mean, it just, the whole thing should strike one as ludicrous, and it just, you know, just such a deviation. I mean, that libertarianism really needs to kind of think hard about its collaborations with various people on the right, especially the corporate right, and, you know, that to me is a really, it's getting people to think about it differently. I've heard some young people misunderstand this. I mean, this is all due respect for people at Cato or Institute of Humane Studies, but they were not the leaders of kind of the most recent wave of left libertarianism. The most recent wave of left libertarianism, where these concerns came to the front, you know, basically the foremost, they're directly from, you know, the Alliance Libertarian Left and the people who were radically anti-empire and the ones who are willing to collaborate with the paleo-libertarians to stop the most horrific, horrible violence against people. That's where this all comes from. I mean, because it very much leads to an understanding of feminism and anti-racism and anti-homophobia, especially when you see militarism in the empire. Really, I mean, what are you talking? I mean, what is the ultimate outcome of patriarchy? Well, it is empire. What else would it be? I mean, it's the big dick ruling your, you know, basically roaming the earth and destroying. People are it's going to make some people uncomfortable, but that's what empire is. So when I think about this time, I mean, people have really, I'm glad everyone has kind of sort of started to think about things like power and how race and sex and so on, but I think we've got a long way to go, and I think there's a little bit too much, you know, congratulating oneself from certain quarters where there wasn't that support 10 years ago when the discussion about, you know, really should the U.S. be engaging in genocidal wars was the most important issue of the day. I mean, I think that was a really telling time. And this, you know, where you stand on war really does, you know, it's like a question of empathy. It's like what I call the Waco test. If you don't understand the very basic right to live, be able to live freely and be able to live without coercion from the state in terms of how you practice your religion, how you practice your sex life, how you structure your family, and you can't see what happened to the Branch Davidians is such a horrible, horrible repudiation of all the bullshit, all the nonsense and propaganda that's taught in the state and the private schools. If you don't understand why that's, you know, why what happened at Waco is horrible and a real test of where people's compassions are in terms of human rights, we really shouldn't be bothering so much with libertarianism because, you know, I mean, a lot of people, you've talked about privilege, a lot of people, you know, who talk about libertarianism or who are libertarians, you know, live a fairly privileged life. They're not going to get beat up by LAPD tonight. And they're, you know, they pay a horrible amount of theft in terms of taxes, but they still have good income. So I mean, if we want libertarianism to be really something, or like have a meaningful statement about, you know, universal human rights, then we really need to get our priorities straight. And the priorities really need to be about war, occupation, torture, not mass, you know, I mean, mass murder that should never be on the table. I don't know. I mean, 2014, we're the most civilized, advanced country in the West, and that's how we still solve conflict, and that's how we create conflict for other purposes. It's really distasteful, and I'm hoping that. Well, this might be a time for some moral evolution and growth on the part of the libertarian movement.
One would freaking hope. Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. What do you think about the possibility, it looks like the likelihood of ramped up conflict in Iraq? How do you think that'll impact Hillary's chances? Because I know that I agree with you. I think that people are really tired of this crap, and that Hillary is not anti-war. She's pretty much a neocon. Do you think that'll hurt her, or what do you think?
Oh God, I'm the worst person to ask political electoral questions. I don't vote, and I stopped following electoral politics a long time ago. But I mean, just a general. My general assumption is that anyone who reaches the top tier of where, you know, he or she should be in terms of, okay, the power classes accept you. So a Bush, a Clinton, or somebody like that, you know, has a, it's not conspiracy, it's consensus. Like, their mentality is all kind of the same. They all socialize with each other, they all interact with each other. You don't need any Illuminatis or crazy meetings. I mean, these people, they go to school together, they intermarry, they all think very narrowly in their little world. It doesn't, I mean, empire is the fact of their life, and they're fine with it. They don't think of it as empire, they just think of it as doing business. And, you know, so anyone who reaches that level has already made that deal with him or herself. So, I mean, and you know, that's how they think about the world. I mean, does anyone think Barack Obama is sincere? I mean, is that true? I mean, do you think, when you think of sincere, do you think Harvard lawyer? Do you think representative of Wall Street? I mean, no, I mean, that's what you get with Barack Obama. It's like that kind of person, or Mitt Romney. And I mean, like, it's curious because, like, it's funny how identity politics play. I mean, you know, no one that's really serious about it really thinks that, like, Mitt Romney would identify with the ordinary concerns of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the average Mormon. Like, I mean, Mitt Romney lives in such a weird world. And the same thing with Barack Obama and African Americans. Like, what possible concern or understanding of any of that could he possibly have? I mean, he's lived a very privileged life, and really a quite interesting and amazing one. So I just, like, I don't know how, I mean, like, these people are the kind of people who are drawn to power in the first place. I mean, their personalities and their lack of ethics. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's all about character. We talk about non-aggression principle. What we're really talking about is your character, where you know that force and fraud are inherently wrong. I mean, like, that you shouldn't have to think too hard about that. That should be the conclusion of just opening up your mouth and breathing in a little.
Makes sense. Fair enough. Can you give us, in the few minutes that we have left, kind of, not so much an overview of what's currently going down in Iraq and what people need to pay attention to, but especially what libertarians need to pay attention to as they write and speak and talk to their friends and pay attention. You know, what's going on? What is the mainstream media kind of not reported on accurately or enough?
Oh, well, in terms of Iraq, you know, there's a whole lack of context in terms of, like, when it invites the experts that are asked to be on shows are very much the people who cheered on the war. I mean, there's no lack of reflection, there's no accountability. We have a very, you know, that commie Noam Chomsky is absolutely right about his media analysis, and has remained right ever since manufacturing consent came out. I mean, the press, you know, it's a very narrow range of views that are allowed to be spoken and not be considered cranky, which is why, you know, and this is kind of the magic of someone like Ron Paul, who knows how to, you know, who knows how to speak to people where where they're at. And this is why, when you speak to people about war, think about where he or she's coming from, not so much where you're coming from. I mean, if you're talking to people, and this is really important when you talk to conservatives and talking to Christians about war, you need to understand. I mean, like, and this is something that you know, Christianity in America probably should really have a reckoning with, is how incompatible militarism is with the most basic, you know, religious traditions. And so when you talk to people, it's not to try to beat them over the head about, you know, other issues like, I care about trans misogyny, but I don't know if I can necessarily tie, I mean, I can't immediately tie that into the war issue, but actually I can. But, you know, that, like, you speak to people where they are currently, their concerns, ask them what it is they're concerned about, what they're afraid of. And you can give them a little bit of history of Iraq. But what it really comes down to, and all these histories are kind of the same. I mean, you know, U.S. intervention has all these chicken and egg cycles that are comically obvious. But it's really that we need to be speaking to people who aren't part of the movement. We need to speak to normal human beings, non-activists. And libertarians have a horrible time more than any other group. And I watch how the other groups bicker, since the anti-war movement gives that kind of perspective in the hard left and the old right. But we really have a hard time learning how to interact normally with others. And if we want things to be a mass movement, if we want libertarianism to not just be the narrow concerns of a few people, then we really are going to have to do that. The movement, a friend of mine who's been dead several years now, but he used to say, the movement's out there. Out there. That's where we need to be making an impact, not amongst each other. I mean, most libertarians agree that the drug war is wrong, that, you know, being able to defend oneself is a basic human right, that government, you know, state monopoly on violence is horrible. These are all things, I mean, nearly every libertarian of every stripe agrees on. And that's, I mean, so it's not that we need to be convincing each other, except maybe on our presentations amongst the outside world, but really it's talking to normal people. And that's where we're going to make the impact. And that's why, for me, libertarian needs to be kind of lean, thin and brutalist. I mean, it needs to be kind of very narrowly focused on the most basic human rights issues and not, you know, we all bring our cultural preferences to it, but whether it's, you know, the paleo diet or, you know, I don't whatever, people's different lifestyle choices that they make and trying to tie
Sure.
them together.
I'm following you, but I'm seeing a little bit of a conflict, and maybe you can explain how it's not, between the idea, and I believe absolutely that libertarianism should be the belief in, you know, less or no state, and that nothing else should be required to be a libertarian. But then you also said it, you know, there's never been a libertarian anti-racist movement. So.
Well, okay. Well, I'll explain. This is a part of the issue. Is that why is racism wrong? Okay. The answer should not be because it offends a few elderly white middle class guys who work at Cato, because I don't really give a damn about their concerns with things. They are not suffering the boot the way others are. They don't feel the same thing. You know, it's not the same. They don't have the same experience that others, including me, have with the state. So, you know, I don't care about racism because it makes them not get invited to the right country clubs. Racism is a table leg of empire. It's one of the things that makes empire real. I mean, what were people called in Vietnam? You know, the human beings that we were shooting at. You know, gooks, slopes, whatever the hell, the horrible, horrible names. I mean, they were non-humans. That's why, you know, we talk about. That's the point of talking about racism in the context of libertarianism. Not because some people who aren't victims of racism feel hurt feelings about it. You know, hurt feelings are not what this is about. We're talking about people literally being, you know, chemically killed, people being slaughtered in the worst possible, most barbaric ways. And that's what racism, that's the consequence of racism, and that's what the drug war is. The new it's the old Jim Crow. It's the same race war we've always had. It's horrible, and that's why we should be against racism, not because, you know, it's not in good taste. Who gives a shit about good taste? We're talking about life and death, and that's the part, you know, that's why I talk about racism. It's not because not because I have any interest in currying favor with anyone in D.C. I mean, if anything, I want to be anti-favor. You know, I don't want to be at the top of their social calendar because I don't think that their values are not. I think are antithetical to those of us who are fighting against power.
That makes sense. I could have a whole conversation with you about libertarians and racism, but we only have 3 minutes left, and I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about Antiwar.com and what you guys are up to besides suing the government, which is awesome, and then any other places that the viewers can find the amazing Angela Keaton.
Well, Antiwar.com, we're the only ones who do what we do. We do it every day, and we keep doing it, even with much fewer and fewer staff members and more stressed out staff than ever. But we're very, very narrowly focused on what our mission is. I mean, we're very, very clear on war, empire, occupation, torture. And that the fact is that the more the state does these things, it hurts civil liberties at home. So even though we don't consider ourselves a libertarian site, we are open to people of all ideologies. In fact, we try to make that part of our editorial policy, where you see all different people from different ideologies represented in discussing anti-intervention and anti-war and these other issues. That allows it to be a broad, you know, we're trying to be a broad-based, you know, a broad mass movement to really change the way people think, turn against empire and militarism, and that they do understand that link, and that's really, really important, that link between empire abroad and the lack of civil liberties at home. And it's something that should concern every libertarian, because what are we talking about? The endless police state. So for that, Antiwar.com, we stay focused on our mission. We do a lot of work with the hard left that forces us to be kind of humble. You start learning about a lot of libertarian conceits when you're forced to build coalitions, and that's the only way there will be mass action, is through building coalitions. You're going to have to deal with other human beings, including people with whom you disagree with on many other issues. So that's kind of, to me, the charm of Antiwar.com. But yeah, it's all about empire. Always comes back to that.
It always comes back to empire. Angela Keaton, thank you for coming on. I hope to talk to you soon. Check out Antiwar.com if you're one of the 3 people who don't know about it, and have a good rest of the afternoon.